The scent of cedarwood and anticipation hung thick in the air, masking the dread that coiled in my stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. I stood at the edge of the gathering circle, my hand instinctively pressed against my still flat abdomen, while 40 pairs of eyes focused on the sacred bonfire crackling at the center of our pack's ceremonial ground. The autumn bonding ceremony happened once every harvest season when the moon reached its fullest potential, and the alpha's lineage was strengthened through mate bonds blessed by tradition and witnessed by the pack. For unmated she-wolves between 18 and 25, attendance wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. For most, this was a celebration, a chance to watch fated mates declare their bonds, to witness the next generation of pack leadership take their rightful place in the hierarchy. For me, it was an execution. 3 weeks I had carried this secret. 3 weeks I had felt the tiny spark of life growing inside me while watching Maury Darrell court Sienna Cornelius, the alpha's daughter, his fated mate. 3 weeks of knowing that what should have been beautiful was actually my death sentence. Foolish, old Maven had said this morning when she confirmed what I already knew, her verdict delivered with the weary resignation of someone who had seen this tragedy play out too many times before. Reckless, my packmates would whisper once they discovered the truth, their voices carrying just loud enough to ensure maximum humiliation, never quite loud enough to warrant direct confrontation. Used, Maury would probably claim if anyone dared to ask him, painting himself as the victim of my supposed seduction, rewriting history to absolve himself of any responsibility. I clutched the worn leather bracelet on my wrist, my mother's last gift before rogues took her from me when I was just 11. It was simple and unadorned. 3 braided strands of brown leather tied with a single silver bead, the metal tarnished with age but still beautiful in its weathered imperfection. "Strength isn't what others see, Lori," she had whispered the night before she died on patrol, her calloused fingers tightening around mine, her wolf's instincts already warning her she might not return. "It's what you find when everything is taken from you. When you're standing in the ashes and you choose to keep breathing. That's when you discover what you're truly made of." I'd worn it every day since, finding courage in its gentle weight against my skin. A reminder that I was my mother's daughter, even if I couldn't be the perfect Omega the pack expected, even if I had failed at every silent rule society had written for someone of my designation and rank. The ceremonial ground had been prepared with meticulous care. Ancient stones arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved with pack symbols worn smooth by generations of wolves who had stood where I now stood. Torches blazed at the cardinal points, their flames casting dancing shadows across the assembled pack, creating an atmosphere both sacred and suffocating. The elders stood on the raised platform, dressed in their ceremonial black and silver, the colors of our pack's legacy. Behind them, pack members had gathered in careful hierarchical order, ranked wolves in the front, warriors flanking the sides, Omegas and lower-ranking members pressed toward the back where I belonged. I recognized every face, had grown up alongside most of them, played in these same woods as children before rank and designation became the lens through which we measured worth. And I became invisible, except as a cautionary tale waiting to be told. "Maury Darrell," Alpha Cornelius called, his voice resonating with the authority that came from 30 years of absolute rule, carrying the weight of tradition and power in equal measure. "Step forward and declare your bond." My heart hammered against my ribs as Maury moved toward the center of the stone circle, Sienna's hand clasped in his. Each step he took felt like a countdown to my destruction. The elders had arranged themselves in formation, their expressions solemn and proud as they prepared to bless this union, this perfect merging of beta bloodline and alpha lineage. Behind them stood our pack, eager to witness tradition unfold, to celebrate the strength this bond would bring. No one was looking at me. Why would they? I was just another Omega in the crowd, unremarkable, easily forgotten. A nobody carrying a secret that would shatter whatever small dignity I had managed to preserve. I kept my gaze fixed on the flames, watching the fire consume the cedar logs, turning solid wood to ash in minutes. A metaphor I couldn't escape. That's what would happen to me once the truth emerged. Everything I was would be reduced to nothing but whispered gossip and judgment. Alpha Cornelius raised his hands, signaling for silence. The murmured conversations died instantly, respect for ceremony and tradition trumping curiosity. He stood before Maury and Sienna, his weathered face illuminated by torchlight, every line and scar a testament to battles fought and won. "We gather today as we have for generations," he announced, his voice carrying across the ceremonial ground with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to command, "to witness and bless the mate bond between Maury Darrell, beta of the Nightshade Pack, and Sienna Cornelius, heir to Alpha lineage. Through this union, our pack grows stronger, our future more secure, our bloodlines intertwined with the strength that has sustained us for centuries." I kept my gaze fixed on those flames, focusing on their chaotic dance, the way they consumed and destroyed without mercy. Anything to avoid seeing Maury's face, to avoid remembering the promises he'd whispered 3 weeks ago when he'd held me differently, when I'd been foolish enough to believe I mattered. "However," Alpha Cornelius continued, his voice shifting to something harder, colder, each word carefully enunciated for maximum impact. "Before we proceed with this blessed union, there is a matter that must be addressed, a shadow that must be brought into the light before sacred vows can be spoken." A murmur rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. I could feel the temperature of the gathering shift, curiosity sharpening into something more predatory. But I forced myself to remain still, to not give any indication that my world was about to implode. "Maury Darrell," the Alpha said, his tone now carrying an edge that made my blood run cold. "You stand before your pack, before your Alpha, before your fated mate. Is there anything you wish to confess before your bond is blessed? Any dishonor you need to cleanse before taking your place as my daughter's mate?" My fingers tightened around my bracelet until the leather bit into my skin. This was it. The moment everything ended. Maury's jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line I'd once found endearing, the one that appeared whenever he felt cornered or challenged. He released Sienna's hand, turned to face the assembled pack, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the ceremonial ground with cold, calculated precision. "I, Maury Darrell, beta of the Nightshade Pack," he announced, each word landing like a physical blow, "formally reject and renounce the she-wolf Lori for acts of seduction and deliberate attempts to entrap me through false claims of connection and intimacy. She is a liar who sought to destroy my fated bond through deception and manipulation." He paused, letting the accusations settle over the crowd like poison. "She is hereby cast from pack protection for her betrayal of our ways." The gathering erupted. Gasps, whispers, shocked exclamations that blended together into a roar of judgment. But I barely heard any of it over the sound of my own heart shattering, over the rushing in my ears as my knees buckled and the world tilted sideways. Someone steadied me. I didn't see who. My vision had tunneled, focused solely on Maury's back as he turned away, as he reclaimed Sienna's hand and stepped back into position as though he hadn't just destroyed another person's entire existence with a few carefully chosen lies. "Lori," Alpha Cornelius's voice cut through my shock like a blade through silk. "Do you deny these accusations?" I lifted my gaze, forcing myself to look at the Alpha, at the pack, at the faces I'd known my entire life. Every single one of them was staring at me now, hungry for drama, eager to witness my humiliation, ready to participate in my destruction. My hand moved to my stomach, protective, instinctive. And in that gesture, old Maven's knowing eyes widened. Several others noticed. The whispers started immediately. "She's pregnant. With his pup. The beta's child. She tried to trap him." My voice, when I finally found it, came out steadier than I expected. "I don't deny that we were together, but I never—" "Silence." Alpha Cornelius's command cracked through the air like a whip. "You will not taint this sacred ceremony with your shame." He looked at me with something between disgust and pity, a combination that made me want to disappear into the earth beneath my feet. "You are cast out, Lori of no family, Omega of no pack. You have until moonrise to gather your belongings and leave our territory. If you are found within our borders after that time, you will be dealt with as all rogues are dealt with." The torches seemed to dim, or maybe that was just my vision darkening as the reality of what had just happened crashed over me. Rogue, pregnant, alone, dead within a week, most likely. Rogues didn't survive long in these mountains, and pregnant rogues, they were targets for every predator, wolf and otherwise, that prowled the wilderness. I should have said something. Should have fought back, defended myself, exposed Maury's lies. But what was the point? He was the beta. I was nothing. His word against mine would never be a fair fight. So instead I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and met Alpha Cornelius's cold gaze with what little dignity I had left. "As you command, Alpha," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked through the gathered pack, through the corridor of judgment and whispered condemnation, toward the edge of the ceremonial ground and the dark forest beyond. Behind me, I heard Alpha Cornelius resume the ceremony, his voice returning to its ceremonial cadence as though the last 5 minutes had been nothing but a minor interruption. "Now, let us proceed with the blessing." But I wasn't listening anymore. I was already running. And then, as I stumbled through the forest, my meager belongings clutched against my chest, my wolf whimpering with rejection pain, the first snow of winter began to fall. I didn't know I was heading north, toward the borders of the northern territories. I didn't know that the most powerful alpha in the 5 kingdoms was about to find me collapsed in a snowdrift at his border. I didn't know that my life was about to begin the moment I believed it had ended. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to keep breathing, had to survive for the tiny life growing inside me that hadn't asked to be born into this nightmare. The forest went silent around me. Not the comfortable quiet of a winter evening, not the natural hush that falls as snow blankets the world, but an unnatural stillness that made every hair on my body stand on end. The wind that had been howling through the trees stopped as though nature itself was holding its breath. Even my own footsteps seemed to vanish into that eerie quiet. And then I felt it. A presence so overwhelming it pressed against my skin like a physical force. Like standing before an inferno. Like the moment before lightning splits the sky, the air grew heavy, charged with power that made my wolf freeze mid-whimper, torn between terror and recognition. I collapsed into the snow, my strength finally giving out. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was a massive wolf emerging from the trees, its fur as black as midnight, its eyes burning gold with ancient power. And somewhere deep in my soul, despite everything, a single word echoed. Mine. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out beneath me, until the ceremonial torches were nothing but distant flickers swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The bundle clutched against my chest contained everything I owned that mattered. My mother's bracelet already on my wrist, a change of clothes, the small pouch of dried meat and bread I'd hidden in my room for emergencies I'd never truly believed would come, and a worn photograph of my mother smiling in her youth, back when the world still held promise. It wasn't much. It was pathetic, actually. 22 years of existence reduced to objects that could fit in a cloth bundle small enough to carry while running for your life. The first snow of winter fell in thick, heavy flakes that clung to my hair and eyelashes, turning the world into a gray-white blur. My thin jacket, meant for autumn weather not winter storms, provided almost no protection against the wind that cut through the fabric like claws through flesh. I should have gone back for warmer clothes, but there hadn't been time, and honestly, I wasn't sure I would have been allowed to take anything more than what I could grab in the 5 minutes of mercy I'd been granted. My wolf whimpered inside me, a sound of pure anguish that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the rejection still burning through our shared soul. Mate bonds, even unofficial ones, left marks when they were severed. The pain was a living thing, sharp and relentless, making every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. And beneath that pain, I could feel her weakness, the way the pregnancy was already draining our combined strength, making us vulnerable in ways that would have been manageable under normal circumstances, but were potentially fatal now. I stumbled over a hidden root, barely catching myself before I face-planted into the snow. My hands were already numb, my fingers clumsy and unresponsive. How long had I been walking? An hour? 3? Time had lost all meaning in the monotony of trees and snow and the desperate need to put distance between myself and the pack that had cast me out. North. Something was pulling me north, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was just the path of least resistance as I followed the declining terrain. The northern territories were dangerous. Everyone knew that. Rogue activity was high in the borderlands, and beyond those borders lay the domain of the northern packs, powerful and territorial, known for their brutal treatment of trespassers. But what choice did I have? East would take me toward human settlements, where a pregnant wolf with no identification, no pack affiliation, and no resources would be picked up by authorities within days. South meant circling back toward Nightshade territory. West led to the Deadlands, where nothing grew and nothing survived. So north it was, into the unknown, into danger, into whatever fate awaited a rejected Omega with nowhere left to run. The blizzard intensified as darkness fell completely, transforming the forest into a disorienting maze of white. I could barely see 3 feet ahead, could barely distinguish trees from shadows, could barely feel my feet anymore as they carried me forward on momentum and stubbornness alone. My wolf's presence, usually a constant companion in the back of my mind, had gone almost silent, conserving what little energy remained. I didn't realize I'd crossed a border until it was too late. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like walking through an invisible curtain. The air itself felt different here, heavier, charged with a power that made my weakened wolf raise her head in alarm. Territory markers, strong ones, ancient ones, the kind that screamed of an alpha powerful enough to imprint his dominance into the very land itself. I'd trespassed into someone's domain, someone who would be well within their rights to kill me for the offense. My legs finally gave out. I collapsed into a snowdrift, my bundle spilling from nerveless fingers, my body too exhausted to fight anymore. The cold was almost welcome now, a numbing embrace that promised an end to the pain, to the fear, to the crushing weight of shame and rejection that had been my constant companion for hours. This is how I die, I thought distantly, frozen in the snow like an animal, alone, unmourned, forgotten before my body is even cold. My hand found its way to my stomach one last time, an apology to the innocent life that would never take its first breath because of my mistakes. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the tiny spark I could feel fluttering inside me. "I'm so sorry." The wind howled around me, and through the screaming storm I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the snow with the confidence of something that feared nothing in these woods. I forced my eyes open, squinting against the driving snow, and saw it. A wolf. Massive beyond reason, its shoulders easily reaching my chest even on all fours. Its fur was pitch black, so dark it seemed to absorb the falling snow before the flakes could even land. But it was the eyes that froze what little breath remained in my lungs, burning gold, ancient and intelligent, and fixed on me with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in my entire life. Alpha. Every instinct screamed it. Not just any alpha. Something far more powerful. Far more dangerous. The wolf padded closer, each step measured and purposeful, its head lowered as it assessed the threat I posed, which was laughable given I could barely lift my head from the snow. It stopped 3 feet away, and I watched as the air around it shimmered, as bones cracked and reformed, as fur receded and flesh reshaped itself in the fluid transformation of a shifter completely in control of their wolf. A man stood before me, tall and powerfully built, his long dark hair falling past his shoulders, his bare torso marked with scars that spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. He should have been freezing in the blizzard, but he stood there as though the cold was nothing, as though winter itself knew better than to touch him without permission. He crouched down, bringing those burning gold eyes level with mine, and when he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, deep and resonant, and carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're on my land, little wolf, and you're dying." His gaze dropped to my hand, still pressed protectively against my stomach, and something flickered across his face too quickly for me to identify. "Both of you are dying." I tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for mercy or a quick death, anything but this prolonged suffering. But my lips wouldn't form words anymore, my voice trapped behind chattering teeth and failing systems. The alpha reached out, and I flinched instinctively, expecting a blow, expecting the killing strike I'd earned by trespassing. Instead, his hand, impossibly warm, pressed against my frozen cheek with a gentleness that made no sense. "Mine," he said softly, the word both question and declaration, confusion and certainty blending together in a single syllable. Then he lifted me from the snow as though I weighed nothing, cradled against his bare chest, his heat seeping into my frozen body like salvation I didn't deserve, and the last thing I heard before darkness finally claimed me was his voice, rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "I've got you now. You're safe." I woke to warmth and softness, sensations so foreign after hours in the frozen wilderness that for a disoriented moment I thought I'd died and somehow stumbled into whatever afterlife awaited wolves who'd made too many mistakes. But death wouldn't hurt this much. Every muscle in my body ached with the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of someone who'd pushed far beyond their limits, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I forced my eyes open, blinking against light that seemed too bright after so much darkness. The ceiling above me was vaulted and grand, dark wooden beams crossing in intricate patterns, and between them, painted stars glittered against a deep crimson background. I turned my head slowly, taking in my surroundings with growing confusion. The bedroom was massive, easily 3 times the size of the room I'd occupied in the pack house, furnished with heavy wooden pieces that spoke of wealth and permanence. Thick tapestries hung on stone walls, depicting wolves running beneath full moons, battles fought and won, ceremonies I didn't recognize. A fireplace large enough to stand in crackled with flames that filled the space with dancing, light, and blessed heat. This wasn't a room. It was a statement of power. "You're awake. Good." The voice came from beside the bed, and I turned to find an elderly woman watching me with keen, assessing eyes. She wore deep green robes marked with silver embroidery, the universal sign of a healer, and her weathered hands held a steaming cup of something that smelled of herbs and honey. "Drink this, slowly. Your core temperature dropped to dangerous levels, and we need to ensure your organs are functioning properly." I struggled to sit up, my arms shaking with the effort, and she helped me with practiced efficiency, propping pillows behind my back. I accepted the cup with trembling hands, taking small sips of the bitter liquid, while she observed me with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too many patients to become emotionally invested in any single one. "Where am I?" My voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. "The Crimson Keep," she replied, pulling back the heavy blanket to examine my feet and legs with gentle but thorough touches. "The heart of the Northern Territories. You're lucky to be alive, girl. Another hour in that blizzard and we'd be preparing your body for burial rites, not treating you for hypothermia and exhaustion." The Crimson Keep. The name sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with lingering cold. Everyone knew of the Crimson Keep, seat of power for the most feared alpha in the 5 kingdoms, home to the wolf who ruled the north with absolute authority and brutal efficiency. Alpha King Redondo Adalberto, the bloodied crown, the wolf who walks alone, the king who had no queen and supposedly wanted none. The baby, I gasped, my hand flying to my stomach, panic overriding every other concern. Is the baby? Stable, the healer interrupted, her expression softening slightly. Fragile but stable. The pregnancy is early enough that your body prioritized keeping the pup alive even as your own systems were shutting down. Maternal instinct is a powerful thing, even in the worst circumstances. She paused, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. Though I'm required to inform the Alpha King that you're carrying another wolf's child. It's protocol when dealing with potential mates who... I'm not his potential mate, I said quickly, desperately. I'm a trespasser, a rogue. He should just cast me out as soon as I'm strong enough to walk, and I'll leave his territory and never... You'll do no such thing. The voice that cut through my rambling was like aged whiskey and distant thunder, smooth and rough in equal measure, carrying an authority that made my wolf sit up and take notice despite her weakened state. I looked toward the doorway, and my breath caught in my throat. The man from the forest stood there, no longer naked but dressed in black leather and dark fabrics that somehow made him seem even more imposing than he'd been in the snow. His long dark hair was pulled back from his face, revealing sharp features that were handsome in a harsh, uncompromising way, all strong jaw and high cheekbones, and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. But it was his eyes that held me captive. Those burning gold eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense I'd ever constructed, stripping away pretense and lies until nothing remained but raw, vulnerable truth. He moved into the room with the fluid grace of a predator, and I watched, frozen, as he approached the bed. The healer bowed respectfully and retreated toward the door, leaving me alone with the most powerful alpha in the 5 kingdoms, and the moment her footsteps faded down the corridor, something inside my chest pulled tight and then snapped into place with a force that stole my breath. The mate bond. Real, undeniable, overwhelming. Not the weak, unofficial connection I'd had with Maury, but the genuine soul bond that legends were built on, that wars were fought over, that wolves spent entire lifetimes searching for and sometimes never found. No, this couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not now. You feel it, Redondo said softly, his eyes never leaving mine, and I heard wonder in his voice beneath the certainty. I've walked this earth for 3 centuries, little wolf. 300 years believing I would never know this bond. That fate had decided I was meant to rule alone. He moved closer, stopping at the edge of the bed, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell pine and smoke and something wild that made my wolf whimper with confused longing. And then you collapsed at my border, half frozen and carrying another's child, and the moment I touched you, I knew. You're mine. I can't be, I whispered, shaking my head even as the bond hummed between us, undeniable as gravity, inescapable as fate. I'm pregnant with another alpha's pup. I'm rejected, cast out. I'm broken and used, and I'll bring you nothing but shame and... Stop. The command in his voice made me fall silent instantly. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight, and reached out to cup my face with a hand that could crush stone but held me with devastating gentleness. Listen to me very carefully, Lori. You are my mate. My fated mate. Given to me by forces older than any pack law or social convention. That bond supersedes everything, including the circumstances that brought you to my door. But the baby is mine, he interrupted, his voice dropping to something dark and possessive that sent shivers down my spine. The pup you carry becomes mine the moment I claim you as my mate. Ancient law, older than the 5 kingdoms themselves. Any child born to a claimed mate belongs to the claiming alpha, with all rights and privileges of blood inheritance. Biology is irrelevant. Choice is everything. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying, unable to reconcile this fierce declaration with everything I understood about pack hierarchy and legitimacy and the importance of bloodlines. You don't understand. I tried again, my voice breaking. I was cast out, publicly rejected, called a seductress and a liar in front of my entire pack. No one will accept me as your mate. No one will. Anyone who challenges my choice will face me, Redondo said. And there was nothing soft in his expression now, nothing gentle in the gold fire burning in his eyes. And I have not survived 3 centuries by losing battles, little wolf. You are mine. The pup is mine. And I protect what's mine with everything I am. His thumb traced my cheekbone, wiping away tears I hadn't realized were falling, and despite everything, despite all the logical reasons this was impossible, despite the shame and fear and crushing weight of my failures, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, impossible hope. Why? I whispered. Because fate is rarely wrong, he replied. And because when I held you in that snowstorm, for the first time in 300 years of existence, I felt complete. 2 days of recovery and luxury did nothing to quiet the voice in my head that kept listing all the reasons this couldn't be real, couldn't last, couldn't possibly end in anything but more pain. The healers came and went with their tonics and examinations. Servants brought meals I could barely touch. And through it all, Redondo appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes sitting silently by the fire while I pretended to sleep, sometimes bringing books he thought I might enjoy, always leaving before I could gather the courage to say what needed to be said. But silence was a temporary shelter, and I'd never been good at hiding from hard truths. I found him in his study on the 3rd morning, the door left open in what I suspected was deliberate invitation. The room was exactly what I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk covered in maps and documents, weapons mounted on the walls between tapestries depicting battles from centuries past. He stood at the window with his back to me, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the snow-covered mountains that stretched to the horizon like jagged teeth. "Come in, Lori," he said without turning, and I wondered if all-powerful alphas developed that unnerving ability to sense presence without looking, or if it was specific to him. "Close the door. This conversation requires privacy." I stepped inside, my bare feet silent on thick rugs, and pushed the heavy door shut with a soft click that felt entirely too final. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He continued studying the mountains, and I continued studying him, trying to reconcile the fierce declaration he'd made in the bedroom with the very real impossibility of our situation. "This won't work," I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could lose my nerve. "You have to see that. You have to understand why claiming me is a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your reign." He turned then, those gold eyes fixing on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. But I forced myself to hold his gaze. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it properly. Needed to make him understand before the bond pulled us both into something that would destroy everything he'd built. "I'm listening," he said quietly, moving to lean against his desk with crossed arms, giving me his full attention in a way that felt both validating and terrifying. "I'm pregnant with another alpha's child," I started, ticking off reasons on my fingers like Maven used to tick off symptoms during healing lessons. Not just any alpha, but a beta who publicly rejected me, who called me a seductress and cast me from pack protection. My reputation is destroyed. Irredeemable. The moment you present me to your court, they'll know exactly what I am, what I've done, and they'll question your judgment for claiming damaged goods." "Continue," Redondo said, his expression unreadable, and I couldn't tell if his calmness was patience or simply the calm before violence. "I'm from a low family. My mother was a pack warrior who died on patrol, and my father was never acknowledged. I have no lineage worth mentioning, no connections to power, no political value whatsoever. Any other she-wolf in the 5 kingdoms would bring you alliances, strengthen your position, provide strategic advantages. I bring you nothing but shame and complications. Are you finished? He asked, and there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp beneath the controlled surface. No. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Your court will never accept me. Your nobles will whisper that you've been bewitched or compromised or made foolish by a convenient bond that appeared at an opportune time. They'll undermine your authority by questioning mine. And the pup. My voice broke, but I forced myself to continue. The pup will grow up knowing they're not really yours, not by blood, and that knowledge will poison everything. You'll resent the child for not being yours, resent me for the constant reminder of my past, and eventually, the mate bond will feel like a trap instead of a gift. The silence that followed my speech was deafening. Redondo stared at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between fury and pain, and something else entirely, and I braced myself for the inevitable agreement, for the moment when logic would override whatever fate had briefly sparked between us. Instead, he pushed off from the desk and crossed the distance between us in 3 strides, catching my face between his hands with a gentleness that contradicted the barely leashed power radiating from every line of his body. Are you finished? He repeated, his voice low and dangerous. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Good. Now you listen to me, little wolf, and you listen carefully because I will only say this once. His thumbs traced my cheekbones, an unconscious soothing gesture that made my traitorous heart ache. I have walked this earth for 300 years, 3 centuries of watching wolves find their mates while I remained alone, 300 years of building power and territory and influence, while wondering why fate had decided I was meant to rule without the one bond that makes existence worthwhile. But I'm not finished, he interrupted, and the command in his voice silenced me instantly. Do you know what 300 years teaches you? That reputation is meaningless, that political alliances are temporary, that bloodlines and lineage are just pretty lies we tell ourselves to justify hierarchies that exist only because we enforce them. His forehead pressed against mine, and I could feel his breath on my lips, could feel the mate bond humming between us like a living thing. You think I care about your past? You think I give a damn what some lesser alpha said about you before casting you out? You think your supposed low birth matters to someone who has toppled kingdoms and rebuilt them according to his own design? The pup. I tried again. Will be mine, Redondo said fiercely. By law older than any pack you've ever known, the law of claiming, written in the first days when our kind learned to shift, states explicitly that any child born to a claimed mate becomes the legal offspring of the claiming alpha. Blood is irrelevant. The bond is everything. The moment I claim you before my court, the moment the lunar claiming ritual binds us together, that pup becomes my heir with all rights and privileges therein. Biology cannot compete with magic, Lori, and our bond is magic in its purest form. I wanted to argue, wanted to list more reasons, wanted to protect him from the mistake I was certain he was making. But he wasn't finished, and the words kept coming like a river that had finally breached its dam. You speak of shame as though it's a permanent condition, as though the judgment of lesser wolves has any bearing on reality. But shame is just a story we're told by people who want us to stay small, to accept their limitations as our own. You were cast out by a pack too blind to see your worth. You were rejected by a male too weak to claim what he'd taken. That doesn't define you, Lori. That defines them. They'll never accept. They'll accept what I tell them to accept. Redondo cut me off, and there was steel beneath the velvet now, the absolute authority of someone accustomed to obedience. I am Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of the 5 kingdoms, and my word is law. If I say you are my mate, my Luna, my queen, then that is what you are. Anyone who questions it questions me. And I have made very clear examples over 3 centuries of what happens to wolves who question my authority. His hands slid from my face to my shoulders, then down to gently rest over my stomach where the tiny life grew. "This pup will be loved," he said softly, the fierce edge giving way to something tender. "Protected, raised as royalty with every advantage my position can provide, and they will never, not for one moment of their existence, doubt that they are mine. Do you understand me? Mine by choice, mine by law, mine by the only metric that matters in this world, love and claim and the conscious decision to be family." Tears streamed down my face, hot and unchecked. Why? Why would you do this? Why would you tie yourself to someone broken when you could have anyone, when you could wait for someone worthy of— "You are worthy," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard from him before. "You survived rejection and exile. You fled into a blizzard to protect your unborn child rather than submit to a life of shame. You collapsed at my border half dead but still fighting, still refusing to give up. That's not broken, little wolf. That's strength. That's exactly the kind of Luna the Five Kingdoms need beside their king." The dress they brought me was the deep crimson of Redondo's house colors, made of fabric so fine it felt like wearing water, with silver embroidery along the neckline and sleeves that caught the light with every movement. The servants who helped me dress moved with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral as they braided my hair and painted my lips, and transformed me from a rejected Omega into something that looked almost like it belonged in a palace. Almost, but not quite. You could dress a stray in silk, but it didn't change what lay beneath. "You look beautiful," Redondo said when he came to collect me, and the sincerity in his voice almost made me believe him. He wore black, as always, but formal now, with silver accents that marked him as royalty, his long hair loose around his shoulders in a deliberate display of confidence. Only alphas secure in their power wore their hair unbound in formal settings. "Are you ready?" No, I would never be ready for this, but I nodded anyway because refusing would only delay the inevitable, and I'd learned long ago that putting off pain didn't make it hurt less when it finally arrived. The throne room was even more massive than I'd imagined, all soaring ceilings and stone columns carved with wolves in various poses of dominance and glory. Torches blazed in iron sconces along the walls, and at the far end of the hall, 2 thrones sat on a raised platform, one noticeably larger than the other, both carved from dark wood and inlaid with silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. The room was already filled with nobles when we entered, at least 100 wolves dressed in their finest, arranged in careful hierarchical clusters that spoke volumes about power and position and who was currently in favor. The conversations died the moment we appeared in the doorway. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward us, and I felt the weight of their judgment like physical blows. Shock rippled through the assembly, followed quickly by confusion, curiosity, and in some faces, barely concealed hostility. Redondo's hand found the small of my back, a gesture of support and claim in equal measure, and we walked forward together down the center aisle, while whispers erupted in our wake like fire catching dry grass. "Is that her? The king's mate? She looks so ordinary. Where did she even come from? I heard she was found at the border, half dead. Look at her stomach, is she— Oh goddess, she's pregnant. With whose pup? Certainly not the king's." The whispers weren't even subtle, weren't even attempting discretion, and I realized with sinking certainty that the lack of subtlety was intentional. They wanted me to hear, wanted me to understand exactly how unwelcome I was, wanted to establish from the first moment that I would never truly belong here no matter what title Redondo bestowed upon me. We reached the platform, and Redondo guided me to stand beside the smaller throne before turning to face his court with the absolute authority of someone who had never questioned his right to rule and never would. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying easily across the vast hall, commanding instant silence despite the shock still radiating from the assembled nobles. "I present to you my fated mate, Lori, who will stand as Luna and Queen of the Northern Territories once the claiming ritual is performed under the next full moon. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the whispers had been. Then, from the front of the assembly, a woman stepped forward, and I recognized power in every line of her body, in the way she moved, in the calculating intelligence behind her cold blue eyes. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, with pale blonde hair and features that belonged on ancient statues, dressed in deep blue that complemented her coloring perfectly. "My king," she said, and her voice was silk over steel, perfectly modulated to carry respect while questioning everything. Forgive my confusion, but I was under the impression that the position of queen required certain qualifications, lineage, training, political connections, the ability to strengthen our kingdom through strategic alliances. Her gaze swept over me with barely concealed disdain. What exactly does this Omega bring to the Northern Territories beyond her obvious condition? Lady Morgana, Redondo replied, and ice crept into his tone in a way that made several nobles step back instinctively. Are you questioning my judgment? Never, my king, Morgana said smoothly, though her eyes promised violence. I simply seek to understand this unexpected development. Surely the court deserves some explanation for why you've chosen an unknown, pregnant outsider over the many qualified she-wolves who have waited centuries for the honor of standing at your side. The implication hung in the air like poison. Morgana had expected to be chosen, had probably been groomed for. The position had likely spent years positioning herself as the logical candidate for queen. And now I, a nobody carrying another male's child, had stolen what she considered rightfully hers. The mate bond requires no explanation, Redondo said coldly, and no justification. Fate chose, and I have accepted fate's wisdom. That should be sufficient for everyone in this room. But it wasn't sufficient, and we all knew it. As Redondo led me to my seat and the formal introductions continued, the whispers resumed, quieter now but no less vicious. Pregnant stray. Desperate Omega who probably threw herself at the king. Has he been bewitched? This is what happens when alphas go too long without proper companionship. They lose perspective. That pup she's carrying will taint the royal bloodline. How long before he realizes his mistake and casts her aside? Dinner was served in the great hall, a feast that should have been celebration, but felt more like endurance trial. I sat at Redondo's right hand at the high table, while nobles filed past to offer congratulations that tasted like ash, and smiles that promised nothing but future cruelty. Morgana held court at a table near the front, surrounded by supporters who kept shooting me looks that ranged from pitying to predatory. I pushed food around my plate, unable to eat under so much scrutiny, and tried not to flinch every time I caught fragments of conversation clearly meant for my ears. Probably doesn't even know which fork to use. Carrying a bastard and pretending it's some romantic fate story. Give it 6 months before he comes to his senses. Redondo's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with mine in silent support. And when I looked at him, I saw fury burning behind his carefully controlled expression. He was hearing everything I was hearing, feeling every slight and insult as keenly as I did. And part of me wondered how many of these nobles would survive the night if he finally lost control of the legendary rage everyone whispered about. "Ignore them," he murmured, leaning close enough that only I could hear. "They're testing you, trying to break you before the claiming ritual makes your position permanent. Don't give them the satisfaction." But ignoring 100 hostile wolves was easier said than done, and as the dinner dragged on through course after course of food, I couldn't taste and conversation I couldn't follow. I felt the weight of my mistake settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't belong here, would never belong here. And no amount of ancient laws or mate bonds or royal declarations would change the simple truth that I was exactly what they called me. A pregnant stray who had stumbled into a position she could never hope to fill. The council meeting happened 3 days after the disastrous dinner, and I'd tried to convince Redondo I didn't need to attend, that political strategy and territorial disputes were beyond my understanding, that my presence would only distract from the actual business of governing. But he'd been immovable on the subject, insisting that the Luna needed to be present for all major decisions, that my perspective mattered even if I didn't yet believe it, that hiding me away would only fuel speculation about the legitimacy of our bond. So I sat in the uncomfortable chair to the right of his throne in the smaller council chamber, surrounded by 24 of his most powerful lords and advisors, trying to make myself as invisible as possible while they discussed border patrols and trade agreements and rogue activity in the Eastern Territories. Most of them ignored me completely, directing all comments and questions to Redondo as though I were simply part of the furniture, decorative and ultimately irrelevant. A few shot me calculating looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention, clearly trying to determine what threat I posed to their own positions and influence. Lord Thaddeus was one of the latter, a barrel-chested alpha with silver streaking his dark hair, and eyes that reminded me of chips of flint, cold and sharp, and looking for something to strike. He commanded the Eastern forces and had been on Redondo's council for over a century, according to the whispered background information a sympathetic servant had provided. Old power, old money, old prejudices that ran deep as mountain roots. The meeting had been running for nearly 2 hours when the conversation shifted to concerns about loyalty among the lower ranks, wolves who might be swayed by promises from rival packs, weaknesses in the current power structure that enemies could exploit. It should have been straightforward discussion of military strategy, but I felt the atmosphere in the room shift, felt tension creeping in like fog rolling off the mountains. "The men are talking, my king," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that always preceded cruelty. "Questions are being raised about recent decisions, about whether certain developments might be affecting your judgment in ways that could prove dangerous for the kingdom." Redondo's expression didn't change, but I felt his power stir, felt the air grow heavy with warning. "Speak plainly, Thaddeus. I have little patience for coded implications." "Very well." Thaddeus leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. "The men are concerned that you've been compromised, that your judgment regarding territorial security and succession planning has been clouded by the sudden appearance of an Omega carrying another Alpha's bastard. They worry that you're being manipulated, that this supposed mate bond is simply convenient timing from a desperate she-wolf who saw an opportunity and seized it." The temperature in the room plummeted. Several council members actually pushed back from the table, instinctively putting distance between themselves and what was about to happen. But Thaddeus either didn't notice or didn't care, pressing forward with the kind of foolish courage that came from decades of privilege and the mistaken belief that past loyalty would shield him from consequences. "It's not just the pregnancy, though, that raises obvious questions about her character and your judgment in claiming damaged goods," he continued, and each word landed like a physical blow. "It's the fact that she brings nothing to the table. No alliances, no strategic value, no skills or training that would benefit the kingdom. She's a liability, my king, and the men are questioning whether you're thinking with your head or your—" He never finished the sentence. Redondo moved faster than my eyes could track, one moment sitting in his throne, the next standing with his hand wrapped around Thaddeus's throat, lifting the larger Alpha clear off the ground as though he weighed nothing. The power that exploded through the room was like being caught in a lightning strike, raw and overwhelming and absolutely terrifying. The air crackled with it, pressing against my skin, making my wolf cower and whimper in submission. "You dare!" Redondo snarled, and his voice wasn't human anymore, wasn't even quite wolf, something ancient and primal that made every instinct scream at me to run, to hide, to get away from the predator that was seconds from killing. "You dare question my mate? You dare insult her in my presence? You dare suggest I am compromised?" Thaddeus's face was turning purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Redondo's iron grip, his eyes bulging with the realization that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. The other council members sat frozen, none of them foolish enough to intervene, all of them no doubt calculating whether Thaddeus's death would benefit or harm their own positions. 300 years I have ruled," Redondo continued, and bones were cracking now, Thaddeus's throat collapsing under the pressure. 300 years of ensuring the northern territories remained strong while lesser kingdoms fell to chaos and weakness. And you think I would allow one Omega, mate bond or not, to compromise that legacy? You think I am that weak? That foolish? Thaddeus made a choking sound that might have been an apology, or simply the last air leaving his lungs. Redondo's hand tightened further, and I watched in horrified fascination as the life began to drain from Thaddeus's eyes, as the moment stretched toward inevitable death, as the legendary rage everyone whispered about finally found its target. I moved without thinking, my hand reaching out to touch Redondo's arm, my fingers wrapping around the corded muscle beneath his sleeve with a gentleness that had no place in this moment of violence. It was the first time I'd voluntarily touched him, the first time I'd initiated physical contact, rather than simply accepting his, and the mate bond flared between us like a star going supernova. "Redondo," I said, softly, and his name on my lips seemed to carry more weight than any command. "Please." He froze, his entire body going rigid, and I felt the war happening inside him through the bond, felt the rage screaming for blood and death, and the permanent silencing of anyone who dared insult what was his. But I also felt something else, something deeper. The part of him that recognized my touch, that responded to my voice, that could be reached even through 3 centuries of conditioning toward violence as the solution to disrespect. "He's not worth it," I continued, my thumb tracing small circles on his arm, soothing, gentling, offering an anchor back from the edge. "Killing him proves nothing except that his words had power, that he could affect you. Let him live with the knowledge that he lost, that you showed mercy because I asked for it." The silence in the council chamber was absolute. Every wolf present was witnessing something unprecedented. The feared Alpha King being pulled back from a killing strike by nothing more than the soft touch of his mate. The legendary rage being tempered by a bond most of them had doubted was genuine. Slowly, incrementally, Redondo's fingers loosened. Thaddeus dropped to the floor in a gasping heap, clutching his bruised throat and dragging in desperate lungfuls of air. Redondo's power gradually receded, the pressure in the room easing until breathing became possible again. But his eyes, when they turned to me, burned with an intensity that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with recognition. "Leave us," he commanded, without looking away from me, and the council members scrambled to obey, dragging Thaddeus's still gasping form with them as they fled. Within seconds, we were alone in the chamber, and only then did his expression crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath the crown and the power. "You stopped me," he said, wonder and confusion blending together. "In 300 years, no one has ever stopped me once the rage takes hold." "The bond," I whispered, suddenly shy, my hand still resting on his arm. "I felt what you were feeling. The anger, yes, but also the hurt beneath it. He insulted me, but the real wound was that he questioned your judgment, your strength, your ability to rule. I couldn't let you kill him for that." Redondo pulled me into his arms, a fierce embrace that felt like coming home and claiming territory in equal measure. "They saw," he said against my hair. "Every wolf in that room saw what you just did, saw that you can temper what they've always feared, that you make me stronger, not weaker. Do you understand what that means?" I thought about Lady Morgana's calculating eyes, about the whispers that followed me through corridors, about the 100 ways I didn't fit into this world of power and politics. But I also thought about Thaddeus's purple face, about Redondo's fingers loosening at my touch, about the bond humming between us with a rightness that felt inevitable as sunrise. "It means they can't dismiss me anymore," I said slowly. "Can't pretend I'm just a pregnant stray with no value, because I have something none of them have, the ability to reach you when no one else can." "Exactly." He pressed a kiss to my forehead, possessive and tender. "Welcome to politics, my Luna. You just won your first battle." The full moon rose over the crimson keep, like a silver eye opening to witness what was about to unfold, and I stood in the center of the ceremonial circle wearing white as tradition demanded, my hands trembling despite the warmth of the autumn evening. The entire court had assembled in the ancient stone amphitheater, carved into the mountainside centuries ago, their faces illuminated by hundreds of torches that cast dancing shadows across worn rock. This was where every significant ritual had been performed since the founding of the Northern Territories, where alphas had been crowned, and wars had been declared, and bonds had been forged that shaped the fate of kingdoms. And tonight, I would either become queen or prove myself unworthy in the most public way possible. Redondo stood across from me in the circle, dressed in ceremonial black and silver, his long hair unbound and moving in the breeze that carried the scent of pine and snow from the peaks above. His eyes never left mine, gold burning in the moonlight with an intensity that made my breath catch. Between us, Elder Cora, the oldest wolf in the Northern Territories, held the ceremonial blade and the silver chalice required for the ancient rite, her weathered face solemn as she prepared to bind us together in a way that could never be undone. "We gather under the full moon as our ancestors gathered." Cora's voice rang out across the amphitheater, carrying to every corner where nobles and warriors and servants pressed together to witness history. "To perform the lunar claiming, oldest of our rites, most sacred of our bonds, what the moon witnesses no wolf may break. What is claimed under her light becomes law written in soul and flesh and magic older than memory." The court responded in unison, their voices creating a harmony that raised the hair on my arms. "Let the moon bear witness, let the claiming begin." Redondo moved first, crossing the circle to stand before me, and when he took my hands in his, I felt the mate bond pulse between us like a second heartbeat. He'd explained the ritual to me during the week of preparation, walking me through each step so I wouldn't be caught off guard. But knowing intellectually what was about to happen, and experiencing it, were entirely different things. I, Redondo Adalberto, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of the 5 kingdoms, stand before the moon and before my people to claim my fated mate, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I claim Lori, who came to me broken and cast out, who survived when survival should have been impossible, who carries new life in her womb that I accept as my own blood and bone and heir." Elder Cora handed him the ceremonial blade, and without hesitation he drew it across his palm, blood welling dark and red in the moonlight. Then he offered me the blade, and I took it with shaking hands, copying his action, gasping at the sharp sting as silver bit into my skin. "Blood to blood," Cora intoned, guiding our bleeding palms together, Redondo's hand engulfing mine as our blood mingled and dripped into the chalice she held beneath. "Life to life, soul to soul." The moment our blood touched, the bond exploded between us with a force that drove me to my knees. Redondo caught me, going down with me, our clasped hands pressed between our chests as power flooded through every nerve, every cell, every fragment of my being. This wasn't the gentle recognition I'd felt in the bedroom or the supportive warmth I'd experienced during the council meeting. This was total immersion, absolute connection, the complete dissolution of the walls that separated his soul from mine. And through that connection, I felt everything. 300 years of loneliness crashed over me like a tsunami. Centuries of watching other wolves find their mates while he remained alone. Decades of wondering if fate had forgotten him. Years of building power and territory and influence, while the one thing that mattered most remained forever out of reach. I felt the desperate hope that had sparked when he'd found me in the snow, the fierce joy that had flooded him when the bond snapped into place, the absolute terror that I would reject him, that I would choose shame and solitude over accepting what we could be together. But beneath all of that, deeper than the loneliness and the hope and the fear, I felt his devotion. Not the shallow affection of Maury's false promises, or the conditional acceptance I'd known in my pack, but something absolute, and unwavering and eternal. He would die for me, would kill for me, would burn the 5 kingdoms to ash if it meant keeping me safe. And the pup I carried, the child that wasn't his by blood, he already loved with a father's fierce protection because it was mine, because it was part of me, because family was choice and he had chosen us both. The revelation broke something inside me, some last desperate defense I'd been clinging to, and I felt tears streaming down my face as Elder Cora continued the ritual, anointing our foreheads with the mingled blood, speaking words in the old tongue that resonated with power. "Do you accept this claim?" she asked me, her ancient eyes boring into mine. "Do you accept Redondo Adalberto as your mate, your alpha, your king? Do you accept his protection for yourself and the life you carry? Do you bind your fate to his for all the days you both shall walk this earth?" I looked at Redondo through the tears and the overwhelming rush of emotion, saw him watching me with barely contained hope and absolutely no doubt, and I realized that somewhere, between the rejection and the rescue, between the hostility and the protection, between the shame and the claiming, I had started to fall in love with this fierce, lonely king who saw value where everyone else saw only failure. "I accept," I whispered, then louder, strong enough for the entire court to hear. "I accept the claim. I accept the bond. I accept you, Redondo, as my mate and my king, now and for all the days I draw breath." The power that surged through the circle at my acceptance was like being struck by lightning and bathed in starlight simultaneously. Pleasure and pain and transformation all rolled into one impossible moment. The mate bond, which had been partial and tentative before, locked into place with a finality that rewrote something fundamental in my soul. I was his. He was mine. The pup was ours, and no force in any kingdom could sever what the moon had just witnessed and blessed. Redondo pulled me against him, his lips finding mine in a kiss that tasted like blood and tears and promises that would never be broken, and the court erupted in howls of approval that echoed off the mountainsides and carried into the night like a declaration of war against anyone who might dare challenge what had just been forged. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, Elder Cora placed the silver chalice in Redondo's hands. He raised it high above his head, his voice carrying across the assembled wolves with the absolute authority of someone who had just claimed his queen. "Behold your Luna," he declared. "Behold my mate. Behold the mother of my heir. Any who question her right to stand beside me questions me directly. And you all know how I respond to such questions." The threat was clear, reinforced by the memory of Thaddeus's bruised throat and the demonstration of power they'd all witnessed. But more than that, they'd all felt the ritual's magic, had all witnessed the moon's blessing, had all seen proof that this was no manipulation or convenient arrangement, but genuine fate made manifest. Lady Morgana stood in the front row, her face a careful mask of neutrality, but I caught the flash of fury in her eyes before she bowed along with everyone else, acknowledging what she could no longer deny or undermine. Redondo helped me to my feet, and together we stood before the court, his arm around my waist, my hand resting over my stomach where our child, because it was truly ours now, bound by magic and blood and ancient law, grew stronger every day. "Let the celebration begin," Redondo commanded, and as music started and wolves began to shift into their animal forms to run beneath the moon in traditional celebration, he leaned down to whisper in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "You're mine now, little wolf. Completely, utterly, irrevocably mine. And I am yours. How does it feel to be queen? I looked up at him, at this king who had claimed me when I had nothing left to give, who had seen worth where everyone else saw only shame, who had fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. And I smiled through tears that were no longer born of pain, but of overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful hope. It feels like coming home, I said. Like I was always meant to be exactly here, exactly now, exactly yours. You were, he replied, pressing his forehead to mine. We both were. The messenger arrived 3 weeks after the claiming ritual, his nightshade pack insignia clearly visible on his traveling cloak, and the moment I saw it, ice flooded my veins despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the breakfast room windows. Redondo read the formal request, with an expression that grew progressively darker, his jaw tightening in a way I'd learned meant he was exercising extreme control over his temper. They're requesting an audience? He said finally, his voice carefully neutral in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. Maury Darrell, along with Alpha Cornelius, and a small delegation. They cite ancient parental rights laws and request negotiation regarding the child you carry. The toast I'd been eating turned to ash in my mouth. He can't. The claiming ritual severed any biological claims. You said, I said the law of claiming supersedes biological parentage, and it does. In the Northern Territories, in the 5 kingdoms that recognize my authority. Redondo set the letter down with barely restrained violence. But the Nightshade Pack falls under the Eastern Coalition's jurisdiction, and they've always maintained that blood rights cannot be magically transferred, that biology is immutable regardless of mate bonds or claiming rituals. His eyes met mine, gold fire burning behind the control. They're going to challenge the legitimacy of my claim to the pup. They're going to argue that Maury's biological connection gives him legal standing. What do we do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded, hating the fear that crept through me at the thought of seeing Maury again, of facing the male who had destroyed me so casually. We meet with them, Redondo said, moving around the table to pull me into his arms, his warmth and strength a bulwark against rising panic. We let them make their arguments, and then we demonstrate exactly why challenging the Northern Territories is a mistake that ends in blood and regret. His hand moved to rest over my stomach, protective and possessive. No one takes what's mine, Lori. Not ancient laws, not biological claims, not desperate alphas trying to leverage their way into power. You and this pup are under my protection, and I will raise kingdoms before I let anyone threaten that. They arrived 2 days later, with enough ceremony to make their intentions clear. This wasn't a simple diplomatic visit or a casual negotiation. This was a formal challenge to Redondo's authority, carefully orchestrated and deliberately provocative. Alpha Cornelius led the delegation, his bearing regal despite being in another Alpha's territory, and, beside him walked Maury, dressed in his beta finest, looking every inch the wronged party seeking justice rather than the male who had publicly destroyed a pregnant Omega to save his own reputation. I stood beside Redondo's throne in the great hall, wearing the deep crimson and silver of my position, my hand resting visibly over my now prominent belly. 4 months pregnant, and the pup was strong, growing well, making their presence known through increasingly frequent movements that Redondo delighted in feeling every night before we slept. Our pup, not Maury's, never Maury's again. Alpha Cornelius. Redondo greeted him with the bare minimum courtesy required between territorial leaders. Beta Darrell. You've traveled far to reach the Crimson Keep. I trust your journey was uneventful. Uneventful enough, Cornelius replied, his sharp eyes taking in the assembled court, the obvious power dynamics, the way I stood beside Redondo rather than behind him. Though we come on difficult business that requires delicate handling. Then let us handle it, Redondo said, his tone suggesting there would be nothing delicate about how this conversation ended. You claim parental rights to the child my mate carries. Explain your reasoning. Maury stepped forward, and I forced myself to meet his eyes, to not show fear or weakness or any of the 1,000 emotions churning in my gut. He looked exactly as I remembered, handsome in a conventional way, with the confident bearing of someone who had never truly faced consequences for his actions. But where I'd once seen strength, I now saw only calculated ambition. Where I'd once seen passion, I now saw manipulation. "Lori," he said, and the familiar way he spoke my name made my skin crawl. "I'm glad to see you're well. I've been worried about you since you left so suddenly." "Since I was cast out," I corrected, my voice steadier than I expected. "Since you rejected me publicly and stripped me of pack protection while knowing I was pregnant with your child." "A mistake," Maury said smoothly, and I recognized the tone, the one he'd used whenever trying to convince me of something that benefited him. I was angry, confused, pressured by my new mate bond with Sienna. But I've had time to reflect, and I realize I acted rashly. "The pup you carry is my blood, Lori, my firstborn. I can't simply abandon my responsibilities as a father." "You already did," Redondo interjected, his voice cutting through Maury's false sincerity, like a blade through silk. "The moment you cast her out, you forfeited any claim to fatherhood. The moment I claimed her under the lunar ritual, any residual biological connection became irrelevant. The pup is mine by law, magic, and choice." "Northern law," Alpha Cornelius said, speaking for the first time since the formalities. "But not universal law. The Eastern Coalition maintains that blood rights cannot be magically transferred, that a biological father retains certain privileges and responsibilities regardless of subsequent mate bonds. We're not here to challenge your claim to Lori herself, but to establish Maury's right to be involved in his child's life." "Involved," Redondo repeated, and something dangerous crept into his tone. "How generous, and what exactly does involved mean? Visiting rights, shared custody, or something more?" The silence that followed was telling. Maury and Cornelius exchanged a glance, and I saw the truth written in that brief communication, saw what they'd really come for, what they'd been planning all along. The child would be heir to the Northern Territories, Maury said carefully. An unprecedented position of power. It would be reasonable for the biological father to have some say in the child's upbringing, some voice in decisions that affect their future. Perhaps a formal arrangement where the child spends time in both territories, learning both sides of their heritage. "So you can influence them?" I said, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. "So you can position yourself as the father of the Northern King's heir? Leverage that connection for political gain? Maybe even manipulate our child into supporting Nightshade interests over their own kingdom's welfare?" Maury's expression flickered, revealing annoyance beneath the false concern. "That's a cynical interpretation." "That's the only interpretation," Redondo said, rising from his throne with the controlled power of a predator preparing to strike. "You don't want a relationship with this child. You want access to power. You want to use your biological connection as leverage, as a way to insert yourself into Northern politics, as a bargaining chip you can play whenever it benefits you." He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood face to face with Maury. "You rejected my mate when she was vulnerable and alone. You branded her a seductress and cast her out with nothing. You gave up every right to call yourself a father the moment you chose your ambition over her welfare and the welfare of the child you created." "Biology doesn't change based on sentiment," Cornelius argued, but his voice lacked conviction, and I could see him reassessing the situation, recognizing that whatever leverage he'd thought they had was rapidly dissolving. "No," Redondo agreed, "but magic does, law does, and in my territories the law of claiming is absolute. The moment Lori accepted my bond, the moment our blood mingled under the full moon, the moment the ancient rite was completed, this pup became mine in every way that matters. Biology is just cells and genetics. Family is choice and commitment and love." His power filled the hall, pressing against every wolf present, until even Cornelius took an involuntary step back. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave my kingdom. You're going to return to Nightshade territory. And you're going to forget you ever had any claim to my child. Because if you ever attempt to Use this pup as a political tool. If you ever try to manipulate my mate or threaten my family, I will demonstrate why I've ruled the Northern Territories for 300 years, while other kingdoms fell to dust." Maury's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You can't just—" "I can," Redondo interrupted. "And I am. This audience is over." As guards moved to escort the delegation out, Maury's eyes found mine one last time, and I saw the truth written there. He'd never loved me. Had probably never even particularly liked me. I'd been convenient, available, and ultimately disposable. And now that I represented power he couldn't access, now that I stood beside a king instead of crawling in the dirt where he'd left me, he wanted to reclaim what he saw as rightfully his. But I wasn't his anymore. Would never be his again. I was Redondo's. I was the Northern Queen. And the child I carried would be raised with love and protection and the kind of fierce devotion Maury would never understand. "Goodbye, Maury," I said softly as he was led past. "Thank you." He stopped, confusion crossing his face. "For what?" "For rejecting me," I replied, my hand moving to cover Redondo's where it rested on my stomach. "For casting me out. For being exactly the kind of male who would abandon his child when it became inconvenient. Because if you hadn't, I never would have found my way here. I never would have found him. I never would have discovered that I deserve so much more than what you offered." The look on his face as guards escorted him from the hall was almost worth every moment of pain and shame he'd caused. Almost. The pain started 3 hours after Maury left. A cramping sensation low in my abdomen that I initially dismissed as stress or indigestion, or any of the dozen minor discomforts that came with being 5 months pregnant. I was in our private quarters, staring out the window at the mountains while trying to process the confrontation, trying to reconcile the male I'd once believed I loved with the ambitious stranger who had stood in the throne room demanding access to a child he'd never wanted. The second cramp was stronger, sharp enough to make me gasp and press my hand against my stomach protectively. Too early. The pup wasn't due for another 4 months, wasn't developed enough to survive outside my body, wasn't ready to face a world that had already tried to destroy us both before we'd even had a chance to begin. "No," I whispered, fear clawing up my throat as the third cramp hit. This one accompanied by a wetness between my legs that could only mean one thing. "No, please, not yet. It's too soon. You're not ready. We're not ready." I tried to stand, to call for help, to do something other than collapse against the window seat as another wave of pain crashed through me. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. My voice came out as nothing more than a whimper. And I felt the pup's distress through the bond we'd formed over months of shared existence. Felt their panic matching my own as my body betrayed us both. This was my fault. The stress of seeing Maury, the emotional trauma of confronting my past, the fear and anger and shame I'd tried so hard to suppress, had finally found an outlet. And now my child was paying the price for my weakness. Just like everyone had always said, I was defective, broken, incapable of doing the one thing Omegas were supposed to do naturally. I couldn't even carry a pregnancy to term without destroying everything. The pain intensified, coming in waves now. And I felt something tearing inside. Felt my body trying to expel the life I'd fought so hard to protect. Blood soaked through my dress. Too much blood. And distantly I knew I was dying. That we were both dying. That this was how it ended for wolves who reached too far above their station and thought they deserved happiness they'd never earned. "I'm sorry," I gasped to the pup. My hand pressed against my stomach as though I could hold them inside through sheer will. "I'm so sorry. I tried. I wanted to give you everything. Wanted to see you grow. Wanted to watch you become everything you were meant to be. I'm sorry I failed you. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough." The door burst open, and servants appeared with healers close behind, their faces pale with alarm as they took in the blood and my deteriorating condition. They moved with practiced efficiency, hands checking vitals and examining damage, voices speaking in urgent tones that told me everything I needed to know about how bad this was. Someone pressed cloth against me to slow the bleeding. Someone else tried to get me to drink something, but the pain was overwhelming everything, drowning me in waves that pulled me under and refused to let me surface. The bond, someone was saying, might have been Elder Cora's voice, but I couldn't be sure through the agony. She needs to use the mate bond, needs to call for her alpha's strength, or neither of them will survive. Lori, listen to me. You have to open yourself to Redondo, have to let his power flow through you. It's the only way. But that meant being vulnerable. That meant admitting I couldn't do this alone, couldn't be strong enough on my own, couldn't protect myself and my child without help. That meant trusting completely, surrendering control, accepting that I was exactly as weak and dependent as everyone had always claimed. All my life I'd been told I wasn't enough, that I needed others to complete me, that independence was an illusion for wolves like me, and asking for help now felt like proving them right, like admitting defeat, like confirming every cruel judgment that had been passed on me. Another wave of pain, worse than before, and I felt the pup's heartbeat stuttering, felt their life force flickering like a candle in a storm. They were dying. We were both dying. And my pride, my stubborn refusal to be weak, was going to cost us everything. Lori! Cora's voice cut through the haze. Stop fighting. Alone. You don't have to be strong enough by yourself anymore. That's what the mate bond means. That's what having an alpha means. Let him help you. The words broke something inside me, some last desperate defense I'd been clinging to. And suddenly I understood. Strength wasn't about suffering alone. Strength was knowing when to reach for the hand being offered. Strength was trusting that the bond was real, that Redondo's devotion wasn't conditional, that asking for help wouldn't make me less worthy of the love I'd been given. I opened myself to the mate bond completely, tearing down every wall I'd maintained even after the claiming ritual, even after accepting him as my mate, even after promising to trust. I reached through the connection with every fragment of strength I had left, desperate and terrified, and finally willing to be vulnerable. Redondo! I screamed, his name ripping from my throat like a prayer and a command and a plea all rolled into one. Redondo, please, I need you, we need you. The response was immediate and overwhelming. His power flooded through the bond like a river breaking through a dam, strong and sure and absolutely unwavering. I felt him running through the keep, felt his terror matching my own, felt his desperate need to reach me warring with the knowledge that I had to survive, that I had to let his strength become mine, that this was why the mate bond existed in the first place. The pain didn't disappear, but suddenly it was bearable. The bleeding didn't stop, but suddenly I had the strength to endure it. The pup's distress didn't fade, but suddenly their life force was anchored to something more than my failing body, connected through me to the Alpha King, whose power had sustained a kingdom for 3 centuries, and would now sustain them through the impossible task of being born too soon. Redondo burst through the door moments later, and the physical connection added to the magical one made everything sharper, stronger, more real. He dropped to his knees beside me, his hands finding mine, his forehead pressing against mine as his power continued pouring through the bond without reservation or limit. I'm here, he said fiercely, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard from him before. I've got you. I've got both of you. You're not alone. You'll never be alone again. Take what you need, little wolf. Take all of it. I'm yours. The healers worked around us, their movements coordinated and desperate as they fought to save 2 lives that were rapidly slipping away. But I barely registered their presence, focused entirely on the bond, on Redondo's strength flowing into me, on the way his power wrapped around the pup like a shield, protecting and sustaining and refusing to let go, even as my body continued trying to expel the life we both wanted so desperately to save. Stay with me, Redondo commanded, and it was both order and plea. "Fight, Lori. Fight for our child. Fight for us. Fight for the future we're going to build together. Don't you dare give up now. Don't you dare leave me after I've finally found you." So I fought. Through pain that should have killed me. Through blood loss that should have ended everything. Through the impossible labor of bringing a pup into the world months before nature intended. I fought because he was fighting beside me, because his strength had become mine, because the bond proved that I'd never actually been alone even when I'd believed I was. And finally, after hours that felt like eternities, a thin cry pierced the air, weak but unmistakably alive, and one of the healers was wrapping something small and fragile in blankets and bringing the bundle toward us. "A girl," the healer said, tears streaming down her face. "Small, far too small, but breathing, fighting. She's a fighter just like her mother." Redondo took our daughter with hands that had commanded armies and ended lives, cradling her with a gentleness that made my heart crack wide open. And when he placed her in my arms, when I looked down at her tiny face and saw her eyes flutter open to reveal gold, bright gold, the same burning color as her father's, I finally understood what it meant to be complete. "Hello, Alara," I whispered, using the name we'd chosen together during long nights of planning a future I'd barely let myself believe in. "Welcome to the world, little star. We've been waiting for you." Alara survived her first night through sheer stubborn will and the constant flow of Redondo's power through the bond. So small she fit in one of his hands. So fragile every breath seemed like it might be her last. But alive and fighting with a determination that reminded me of everything I'd endured to bring her into this world. The healers kept vigil through the dark hours, monitoring her temperature and breathing, feeding her drops of specially prepared formula since she was too weak to nurse, whispering prayers to the moon goddess for strength and resilience and the miracle of continued life. I watched from my bed, too weak to stand but refusing to sleep, my eyes tracking every rise and fall of her tiny chest in the enchanted warming box the healers had constructed beside me. Redondo sat between us, one hand on my shoulder and the other resting gently on Alara's blanket, his power flowing steadily to both his mate and his daughter, sustaining us through the critical hours when survival hung by spider silk threads. "She needs the blood binding," Elder Cora said as dawn broke over the mountains, her ancient eyes assessing Alara with the practiced knowledge of someone who had overseen countless births and deaths over her long life. "The ritual that will fully transfer your lineage, that will complete the claiming magic and give her access to your alpha strength permanently, rather than just through the mate bond's temporary channel. Without it, she'll remain fragile, caught between her biological heritage and her claimed one. With it, she becomes fully yours in every way that matters, and your power becomes hers by birthright." "Now?" Redondo asked, concern evident despite his controlled tone. "Is she strong enough for the ritual?" "She'll never be strong enough if we don't perform it," Cora replied. "The blood binding is what will give her the strength to survive. Right now she's drawing on your power through Lori like water through a narrow channel. The ritual will open a direct connection, will make her your heir, not just by law, but by magic, by blood, by the ancient transformation that makes such things possible for true mates." So we prepared for the second ritual in as many months, though this one would be private, witnessed only by the healers and Elder Cora, performed in our quarters rather than before the assembled court. Redondo lifted Alara from her warming box with infinite care, cradling her against his bare chest where she looked impossibly small and vulnerable, and I struggled to sit up despite the healer's protests, needing to witness this moment, needing to see the magic that would bind my daughter to the male who had chosen to be her father. Elder Cora brought the ceremonial blade, cleaned and blessed, and began the ancient words in the old tongue that resonated with power older than kingdoms. Redondo held Alara in one arm while extending his other hand palm up, and without hesitation, drew the blade across his flesh in a clean line that welled immediately with dark red blood. Then with movements so gentle I barely breathed, he made the smallest possible cut on Alara's tiny palm, just enough to bring forth a single drop of blood that looked black against her pale skin. He pressed their palms together, his massive hand completely engulfing hers, and the air in the room seemed to compress, to hold its breath. As the blood-binding magic activated, I felt it through the mate bond, felt the power flowing from Redondo into our daughter, felt the transformation happening on a level deeper than flesh or genetics or biology, felt the moment when claimed became real in a way that transcended every natural law. And then Alara's eyes opened, and they blazed with gold fire. Not the brown of Maury's beta lineage, not the uncertain hazel that might have marked her as caught between two fathers, but pure, undiluted gold, the burning alpha power that marked the Northern Territory's royal line, that marked Redondo's bloodline, that marked her as his daughter in every way that mattered. "Impossible," one of the healers whispered, staring at Alara with something between awe and fear. "The blood-binding transfers lineage, yes, but I've never seen it manifest so completely, so visibly. It's as though she was reborn in that moment, as though biology itself was rewritten." "Not impossible," Elder Cora corrected, her weathered face split by a rare smile. "Just rare. It happens when the mate bond is strong enough, when the claiming alpha's devotion is absolute enough, when the magic recognizes that this is right in a way that transcends human understanding of how things should work. This pup was always meant to be Redondo's daughter. We simply made manifest what fate had already decided." Alara's breathing steadied immediately, her color improving from the grayish pallor that had terrified me to a healthy pink that spoke of vitality returning. The transformation was immediate and undeniable, strength flowing into her tiny body now that she had direct access to her father's power, now that she was no longer caught between two bloodlines, but firmly anchored in one. 3 weeks later, we stood before the assembled court in the Great Hall, and I was steady on my feet despite the ordeal I'd survived, Alara cradled in my arms and watching the gathered nobles with alert gold eyes that missed nothing. She'd grown stronger every day, thriving now that the blood binding had secured her connection to Redondo's power, and the healers proclaimed her completely healthy despite her premature arrival. The court had gathered for the formal presentation, the moment when we would officially introduce the heir to the Northern Territories, and I could see the curiosity and speculation written on every face. They'd all heard about the dramatic birth, about Maury's challenge and subsequent departure, about the blood-binding ritual and its unprecedented results. Now they would witness the proof. Redondo stood beside me in full ceremonial regalia, every inch the Alpha King. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast hall with absolute authority. "My lords and ladies, I present to you Alara Adalberto, Princess of the Northern Territories, heir to the Crimson Keep. My daughter by blood-binding and mate claim, born of Queen Lori and claimed by me according to the oldest laws of our kind." He paused, letting the formal declaration settle, then continued with something softer, something more personal that I hadn't expected. "Many of you questioned my choice of mate. You saw a pregnant Omega cast out by her pack and wondered what value she could possibly bring to the Northern Territories. You whispered about compromise and bewitchment and poor judgment." His eyes swept the crowd, and several nobles had the grace to look ashamed. "But I saw what you couldn't. I saw strength in survival. I saw resilience in the face of rejection. I saw a wolf who fought for her child even when the world had turned against them both. And I saw my fated mate, the one the moon goddess chose for me across 3 centuries of waiting." He turned to me then, his hand finding mine, and I felt the mate bond pulse between us with the same intensity as the day we'd been claimed. "Lori, would you like to address the court?" It wasn't required, wasn't part of the formal ceremony, but I understood what he was offering. The chance to speak for myself, to define my own place rather than letting others define it for me, to claim my position with my own voice, rather than simply accepting it through his authority. I looked down at Alara, at her bright gold eyes and her father's strong features already visible in her tiny face, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From rejection to rescue, from shame to sovereignty, from believing I was worthless to standing as queen before the 5 kingdoms. I won't pretend my path here was conventional, I said, and my voice carried surprisingly well despite my nervousness. I won't pretend I came to you with the lineage or training or political connections you expected from your queen. I came broken, cast out, carrying another male's child, and believing I had nothing left to offer the world except my death in a snowstorm. The court listened in absolute silence, and I saw understanding dawning on some faces, recognition of the courage it took to speak these truths publicly. But Redondo saw something different. He saw value where everyone else saw only failure. He saw strength where I saw only weakness. He saw a mate where I saw only a burden. And through his eyes, through the bond we share, I began to see it too. I shifted Alara slightly, and she made a small sound that drew smiles from even the sternest nobles. This is Alara, born too soon, born of trauma and stress, born into circumstances that should have killed us both. But she survived because of the mate bond, because her father's strength flowed through me when mine wasn't enough, because family is more than biology, and love is more than genetics. I met Lady Morgana's eyes across the hall, saw the resignation there now, rather than the hostility, saw acceptance that what had been forged between Redondo and me couldn't be broken by ambition or political maneuvering. I understand that some of you will always question whether I deserve to stand here. I understand that my past will always be part of how you see me. But I also understand something more important. That second chances are real. That chosen family is as valid as blood family. That strength comes not from never falling but from rising every time you're knocked down. I smiled, feeling Redondo's pride through the bond. I am Queen Lori Adalberto. This is my daughter, Princess Alara. This is my mate, Alpha King Redondo, and together we will rule with the wisdom that comes from knowing what it means to survive, to be rejected, to be claimed, and to finally believe we deserve the love we've found. The court erupted in genuine applause, not the polite acknowledgement of forced approval, but real recognition of truth spoken from the heart. Even those who had been most hostile seemed moved, and I saw more than one noble wiping tears away while trying to maintain their dignified facades. Redondo pulled me close, Alara between us, and pressed a kiss to my forehead that felt like a promise and a celebration and a beginning all rolled into one perfect moment. "Welcome home, my queen," he whispered against my hair. "Welcome to the life you were always meant to live." And surrounded by the court that had once questioned my worth, holding the daughter who bore her father's golden eyes, standing beside the mate who had claimed me when I had nothing left to give, I finally, completely, irrevocably believed him. This was home. This was family. This was the future I'd been meant for all along, written in fate and sealed by magic and made real by the simple truth that love, real love, doesn't require perfection. It only requires the courage to accept it when it's offered.